It was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon in a small, peaceful town. The weather was perfect, and the streets were alive with families enjoying the day. One such family, the mayor's family, was going about their weekend routine. The mayor's daughter, a young woman in her early 20s, had decided to run some errands. She wasn't in a rush, just taking the time to gather a few things for the week ahead. Her car hummed softly as she drove through the familiar streets, a sense of calm settling over her. She stopped by the local grocery store, something she did regularly, and parked her car outside. The town was small enough that everyone knew each other, so it wasn't unusual to see familiar faces. It was a place where people smiled and waved as they went about their day. But on this day, something would happen that would change everything for her and her family. After picking up a few items, she walked back to her car, carrying a shopping bag in one hand. The sun was still high in the sky, and she couldn't help but feel at peace with the world around her. But as she approached her car, she noticed something unusual. There was a police officer parked on the other side of the street, his vehicle idle and his gaze fixed ahead. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police officers were a common sight, and she had seen this particular officer around town before. But as she opened her car door, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning around, she was met with the sight of the officer approaching her. She didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he had a question or needed to speak with her about something. However, the officer's demeanor quickly made her realize this was no ordinary encounter. Without any warning, the officer drew his gun, pointing it directly at her. Her heart stopped for a moment, a rush of panic flooding her chest. The officer's face was tense, his eyes narrowed, and there was something in his posture that didn't seem right. She instinctively took a step back, her mind racing. What had she done to deserve this? "Step away from the car," the officer barked, his voice sharp and aggressive. Confused, she raised her hands slightly, trying to show that she meant no harm. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice shaky. "Why are you pointing a gun at me?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, still holding the gun aimed at her. "Don't play dumb," he sneered. "You know exactly what you're doing." His words didn't make any sense. She had done nothing to provoke him. She was just a young woman minding her own business, trying to enjoy a simple errand. The officer's aggression was completely unprovoked. It was then that she realized the officer wasn't just reacting to something she had done. It seemed like he was reacting to something about her. Something deeper. He began to shout racial slurs, his words cutting through the still air like a knife. The more he spoke, the more her confusion turned to fear. She didn't understand why this was happening. She had grown up in this town, a place where she had always felt safe. But now the very police officer who was meant to protect her was threatening her with violence. "Get away from the car. Don't make me use this," he shouted, his voice growing louder, his hand gripping the gun tighter. She could see his knuckles turning white. Her breath quickened, and for a brief moment she felt paralyzed by fear. But then something inside her clicked. She wasn't going to stand there and be threatened without a fight. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, her mind racing as she dialed her father's number. He was the mayor, and he had always taught her to stand up for what was right. She knew he would know what to do. Her fingers fumbled as the phone rang. Each second felt like an eternity as the officer's shouts grew more frantic. Finally, her father answered, his voice calm but filled with concern. "Dad, it's me," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "There's a police officer and he's pointing a gun at me. He's being racist and I don't know what to do." Her father's voice immediately became more alert. "Stay calm, sweetheart. Don't do anything that might provoke him further. I'll be there in a minute. Just keep the phone with you." She could hear the urgency in his voice, and it gave her a small sense of relief. Her father's words gave her the strength to stay where she was, even as the officer continued to make threats and insults. "Do you know who I am?" she asked the officer, trying to sound confident. "My father is the mayor of this town. What you're doing is wrong." But the officer wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on her with a look of contempt, and his words became more venomous with each passing second. It was as if he was determined to make her feel powerless, to assert his dominance over her with his badge and his gun. Before long, a few people had gathered nearby, having noticed the confrontation. They were silent at first, unsure of how to intervene. But then, one of the bystanders spoke up, urging the officer to lower his weapon and step back. The officer ignored them. his focus solely on the young woman in front of him. It wasn't long before additional police cars arrived on the scene, their sirens wailing as they pulled up to the curb. Her father's voice came through the phone again, more forceful this time.
"Step back!"
"I'm on my way right now. Don't do anything to escalate this situation." As the other officers approached, the racist officer finally lowered his weapon, but his eyes still burned with anger. The situation had reached a boiling point and the tension in the air was thick. The bystanders who had been watching were now speaking out, their voices louder, their accusations sharper. The officer was taken into custody without resistance, though his expression remained defiant. It was clear that he hadn't expected things to escalate the way they had. The young woman, still shaken, was surrounded by officers who ensured her safety. One of them spoke to her gently, asking if she was all right. Though she was physically unharmed, emotionally she felt like she had been struck by a freight train. The events of the past few minutes had felt like a nightmare, something she never could have imagined happening in her small, quiet town. As she watched the officer being led away in handcuffs, she knew this wasn't over. The town had just been shaken to its core, and her family would be at the center of the storm. Her father arrived soon after, his face a mixture of anger and worry. He rushed to his daughter's side, pulling her into an embrace. The mayor had always been a man of composure, a pillar of strength for his community, but in this moment he couldn't hide the fury he felt. His daughter had been targeted because of her race, and no matter who the officer was, that was something he couldn't and wouldn't ignore. The young woman didn't speak much as her father led her away from the scene. Her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. How could something like this happen in a place that she had always thought of as home? What kind of person would act in such a hateful, irrational way? As they drove away, her father's voice broke the silence. "We'll get to the bottom of this. No one should ever be made to feel the way you did today." The events that had unfolded in a matter of minutes were only the beginning. What followed would change the course of their lives and the life of the town forever. In the days that followed, the entire town seemed to be in shock. The young woman, still trying to process what had happened, found herself replaying the incident over and over in her mind. She couldn't understand how someone, especially someone who wore the uniform of a police officer, could act with such aggression. The more she thought about it, the more it bothered her that this officer had treated her like a criminal when all she had done was go about her day. She had always trusted the police to protect her, but now that trust was shattered. Her father, the mayor, was equally troubled. He had spent years building relationships with the community, always striving to ensure that justice was served and that everyone felt safe. But now, one officer's actions had raised questions about the very system he had worked so hard to support. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and he knew that the only way to restore trust in his town was to ensure that the officer was held accountable. But he also knew this wasn't just about the officer's behavior, it was about a much larger issue. It was about race, power, and the way authority figures could abuse their positions. The first few days after the incident were filled with phone calls, meetings, and conversations with law enforcement officials. The mayor had called for an immediate investigation into the officer's actions, and while some were quick to support him, others hesitated. There were murmurs in the community. Some people believed that the officer's actions were justified, that the young woman had somehow provoked him. But the majority of people who spoke out sided with the mayor's daughter. The video footage from bystanders had made it clear that the officer had overreacted, and his use of racial slurs only added fuel to the fire. As the investigation began, the mayor's family found themselves in the middle of a media storm. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, broadcasting the shocking incident to a wide audience. The young woman, who had once led a relatively quiet life, was now thrust into the spotlight. It was overwhelming, to say the least. She had never imagined that something like this could happen to her, let alone make national news. But she also knew that this was bigger than her. It wasn't just about her being targeted by an officer. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was an opportunity for change. If she could help bring attention to the issue, maybe it would spark a conversation that would lead to real reform. The town was divided. There were those who stood with the mayor's family, demanding justice for the young woman and accountability for the officer. But there were also others who argued that the officer's actions weren't as severe as they seemed, that he had simply been doing his job. Some people didn't want to believe that a police officer could be capable of such behavior. After all, police were supposed to protect the community, not threaten it. But as the days went on, the evidence began to paint a clearer picture. Witnesses who had been at the scene spoke out, recounting what they had seen. Several people had recorded the confrontation on their phones, and those videos provided crucial evidence that the officer had acted without provocation. In the footage, the officer could be seen pointing his weapon at the young woman, shouting at her and making racial comments. It was disturbing to watch, and it left no room for doubt about the officer's intentions. The mayor, while keeping his emotions in check for the public, was deeply affected by the events. He couldn't understand how someone who had taken an oath to protect and serve could act in such a reckless, hateful manner. It was a betrayal of everything he had worked for in his career. And as a father, he was heartbroken that his daughter had been the target of such behavior. He wanted to do everything in his power to make sure that the officer was held accountable. But the mayor also knew that this wasn't just about one bad apple. The officer's actions were part of a larger problem within the system, one that needed to be addressed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a local issue. It was part of a much bigger conversation about race, policing, and justice in America. He began speaking out publicly, calling for reforms within the police department. He demanded better training for officers, more oversight, and a greater focus on community relationships. Meanwhile, the officer who had pointed the gun at the young woman was placed on administrative leave, while the internal investigation took place. He continued to deny any wrongdoing, claiming that he had felt threatened by the woman. His defense was that he had been trying to protect himself, but his actions didn't line up with his explanation. It became clear to the investigators that the officer's version of events didn't match the video evidence or the testimonies of the witnesses. The officer's conduct was now under intense scrutiny. As the investigation unfolded, it became evident that this wasn't the first time the officer had acted inappropriately. There had been previous complaints about his behavior, but they had been dismissed or overlooked by his superiors. This was a pattern of misconduct, not an isolated incident. The more the investigation revealed, the more people began to question how such a person had been allowed to continue serving as a police officer. How had his behavior been tolerated for so long? The officer's past actions were now coming to light, and many people were angry that they hadn't been addressed sooner. It was clear that the department had failed to properly investigate previous complaints, and now the entire community was paying the price. As the pressure mounted, the officer's colleagues began to distance themselves from him. Some were shocked by his actions, while others were more reluctant to speak out. But there was no denying the truth anymore. The officer had crossed a line, and he was going to face the consequences. The mayor, for his part, was unwavering. He knew that if he allowed this incident to go unaddressed, it would send the wrong message to the community. He couldn't let his daughter's experience be swept under the rug. This was a turning point for the town, and he was determined to make sure that justice was served. As the investigation continued, the young woman began to feel the weight of the situation more heavily. She had always been a private person, someone who valued her personal space and kept to herself. Now she found herself constantly in the public eye. Reporters showed up at her door, and her phone rang constantly with calls from media outlets wanting to interview her. She wasn't sure she was ready for this level of attention, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Her father supported her every step of the way, helping her navigate the media frenzy and offering reassurance when she felt overwhelmed. The young woman was beginning to realize that her voice had power. She could speak out about what had happened to her, and maybe, just maybe, her story would make a difference. But even as she found strength in her father's support, she couldn't escape the feeling of fear that still lingered in her chest. She had been threatened with a gun, and no matter how much she tried to push it out of her mind, the images of that day kept returning to her. She had never expected something like that to happen to her, especially not in a place where she had always felt safe. As the investigation drew closer to its conclusion, the community's attention was firmly focused on the outcome. The young woman's father, the mayor, knew that the next steps would be crucial. He had promised to make sure that justice was done, and he wasn't about to back down. The officer would have to face the consequences of his actions, and the town would have to reckon with the larger issues at play. The weeks following the incident were a blur of press conferences, meetings, and legal proceedings. The mayor's daughter, who had once lived a quiet life in a small town, now found herself at the center of a storm that she never could have imagined. The media had latched onto the story, and the public outcry grew louder with each passing day. For the mayor, the pressure was mounting, and every decision he made seemed to be under a microscope. Yet he remained determined to ensure that justice was served, not just for his daughter, but for the entire community. The investigation was progressing, but it wasn't as simple as many had hoped. The officer who had pointed the gun at the mayor's daughter was still insisting that his actions were justified. He claimed that he had been threatened, that he had felt unsafe in the situation. His defense, however, was weak. There were no signs that the young woman had posed any danger. The video footage from bystanders told a different story, one of an officer acting recklessly, using his authority in a way that was both disproportionate and unjustified. The officer's colleagues, who had initially been reluctant to speak out, were slowly beginning to come forward. Some offered statements about his past behavior, confirming what many had already suspected. The officer had a history of aggression and had often displayed a lack of judgment in his interactions with civilians. But despite these revelations, the investigation was taking longer than expected. The legal process was slow, and the community's frustration was growing. The mayor, for his part, worked tirelessly to push for accountability. He knew that this case was not just about one officer. It was a reflection of a larger problem within the police force and, perhaps, within the system itself. The more he learned about the officer's past, the more it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. There had been previous complaints about the officer's conduct, but they had been swept under the rug. No one had taken them seriously. The mayor had come to realize that the officer's actions were just one symptom of a much deeper issue, and the community needed to confront it head-on. As the investigation continued, the mayor's daughter struggled to process everything that had happened. She had always been a private person, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But now she was finding it hard to escape the constant attention. Reporters were always calling, and her every move seemed to be scrutinized by the public. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. Despite the attention, she knew that her story could make a difference. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been targeted or mistreated because of their race. Her own experience had opened her eyes to the harsh realities faced by many in her community. It wasn't enough to just seek justice for herself. She wanted to be part of the change that was needed. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that her voice could help bring about a shift in the way people viewed law enforcement and the treatment of marginalized communities. The mayor, ever the protector, continued to support his daughter. He knew the emotional toll that this was taking on her, and he was determined to help her navigate the challenges ahead. But as much as he wanted to shield her from the pain of the situation, he also knew that this was a moment of reckoning for their town. The incident had revealed cracks in the system, and now it was time to address them. The pressure on the mayor grew as the trial date approached. The community, divided in its opinions, was waiting to see what would happen next. Would the officer be held accountable, or would he be given a lighter sentence? Would the town take a hard look at its police force and begin the process of reform, or would it continue to sweep uncomfortable truths under the rug? These questions loomed over the town like a dark cloud. The mayor was keenly aware that the outcome of the trial would set the tone for the future of the town. If the officer was found guilty and given a significant sentence, it would send a message that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. But if he was let off lightly, it could reinforce the belief that those in positions of authority were untouchable. The trial itself was an emotional roller coaster. The young woman took the stand, her voice trembling as she described the terrifying moments she had spent facing down a gun. She spoke about the officer's threats, the racist comments he had made, and how helpless she had felt. The courtroom was silent as she recounted the events, her words powerful and filled with emotion. It was clear that her testimony was having an impact, not just on the jury, but on everyone in the room. Her father, the mayor, watched from the back of the courtroom. He was proud of his daughter, but he was also deeply pained by what she had gone through. He knew that this was a moment of reckoning not just for the officer, but for the entire town. It was hard for him to see his daughter in such pain, But he also knew that she was doing something important, something that could help change the future for others. The defense team tried to poke holes in the young woman's testimony, questioning her memory and suggesting that she might have misinterpreted the officer's actions. But the evidence was clear. The videos from bystanders painted a vivid picture of the officer's aggression, and the witnesses who had seen the confrontation corroborated her story. The defense team's arguments were weak, and it became clear that the officer's actions were indefensible. The prosecutor's case was strong, and as the trial continued, it became more and more apparent that the officer had crossed a line. He had not just endangered the young woman's life, but he had also violated the public's trust. His actions were not just a personal failure, they were a reflection of a larger issue within law enforcement that needed to be addressed. The trial stretched on for several weeks, but in the end, the verdict came down. The officer was found guilty on multiple charges, including misconduct, racial discrimination, and the unlawful use of force. The community erupted in a mixture of relief and anger. The relief came from the fact that justice had been served, but the anger stemmed from the realization that this type of abuse had been allowed to continue unchecked for so long. As the officer was led away in handcuffs, the young woman felt a sense of closure. It wasn't a complete victory. There was still much work to be done to address the systemic issues within law enforcement. But it was a step in the right direction. She had helped bring about change, and that gave her a sense of peace. For the mayor, the victory felt bittersweet. He had always known that the road to justice would be long and difficult, but he had hoped that it would have been easier. He had hoped that the officer's actions would be an isolated incident, but now he knew that they were part of a much larger problem. The real work was just beginning, and he was ready to take on the challenge. As the town began to process the outcome of the trial, the mayor and his daughter knew that they had made a difference. But they also knew that the fight for justice wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The months following the trial were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The officer had been sentenced and justice had been served in the eyes of the law. But for the mayor and his daughter, the sense of closure was far from complete. Though they had fought hard for accountability, they knew that the town and the police force still had a long way to go before things would truly change. For the young woman, the days after the trial felt strangely quiet. The media attention had started to fade, but the emotional toll of the entire experience still lingered. She had been forced to relive the trauma of that day over and over, not just for the trial but in the public eye. Yet there was also a sense of pride in knowing that her bravery had played a part in bringing the officer to justice. She had done what many would have been too afraid to do. Her actions had sparked a larger conversation about race, power, and accountability, and she couldn't help but feel that the world was starting to take notice. Still, the young woman found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but she had realized that her story was important. It wasn't just her personal experience, it was the experience of many others who had faced similar injustices. She could no longer ignore the deeper issues that had come to light in the wake of the officer's actions. This was bigger than one bad cop. It was about the way entire systems were set up to protect those in power, while those who were vulnerable often had no voice. In the days after the trial, the mayor began meeting with local leaders, activists, and members of the police department to discuss the future of law enforcement in their town. He had always believed in the good of the police force, but the events of the past months had made him realize that there were serious flaws in the system. The officer who had pointed a gun at his daughter wasn't just an isolated case of misconduct, he was part of a larger problem, one that needed to be addressed head-on. The mayor had come to the difficult realization that the town's police force needed a complete overhaul. It wasn't just about firing bad officers. It was about building a department that valued transparency, accountability, and respect for all citizens. He knew that this wouldn't be easy, and that change would take time, but he was determined to see it through. He began working on new policies aimed at improving relations between the police and the community. He pushed for more comprehensive training on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and bias prevention. The mayor also called for a more diverse police force, one that reflected the community it served. The police chief, who had once been reluctant to confront the issue head-on, was now on board with the mayor's vision for reform. He knew that the officer's actions had damaged the trust between the community and the police, and he was willing to take the necessary steps to rebuild that trust. But not everyone in the department was as eager to embrace change. Some officers were resistant to the idea of reform, fearing that it would undermine their authority. The mayor and the police chief worked tirelessly to address these concerns, explaining that accountability and transparency would only make the department stronger in the long run. Meanwhile, the young woman found herself increasingly involved in the discussions about reform. She had never thought of herself as an activist, but after everything she had been through, she felt a responsibility to speak up. She began attending town hall meetings, speaking to local groups, and sharing her story. She talked about what it had been like to face down a gun for no reason, to feel the weight of racial bias pressing down on her. She spoke not only for herself but for everyone who had been treated unfairly by those in power. Her words resonated with many in the community. There were others who had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement, and they felt emboldened by her courage to speak out. For the first time in a long time, people were having open and honest conversations about race, power, and privilege. It was uncomfortable for many, but it was necessary. The town was beginning to face its flaws, and it was clear that the conversation was only just beginning. As the mayor continued to push for reform, he faced backlash from some members of the community who were uncomfortable with the changes. Some felt that the police were being unfairly targeted, while others believed that the reforms didn't go far enough. The mayor understood that not everyone would be on board with the changes, but he also knew that progress often came with resistance. The key was to keep the conversation going, to keep pushing for the kind of change that would make the town a safer and more just place for everyone. The young woman, too, was finding her voice in a way she never had before. She had once been content to stay in the background, to live a quiet, private life, but now she felt a deep sense of purpose. She wanted to make sure that what had happened to her never happened to anyone else. She had learned that silence only allowed injustice to persist. Her father's support and guidance had helped her find the strength to speak up, but now she was doing it for herself, for her community, and for everyone who had been marginalized or mistreated. Though the process of reform was slow and met with resistance, there were small victories along the way. New policies were put in place to ensure greater accountability, and the police force began to implement more comprehensive training on de-escalation and bias prevention. The mayor and his daughter worked together to keep the momentum going, pushing for positive change at every opportunity. But even as the town began to take steps toward healing, there was still a sense of uncertainty in the air. The young woman knew that the fight wasn't over. Even with the officer convicted and sentenced, and the town beginning to make strides toward reform, there was still so much work to be done. The issues that had been exposed were not going to disappear overnight. It would take years of hard work, honest conversations, and committed action to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. As the young woman continued to speak out, she received messages of support from people across the country. Some shared their own stories of police violence and racial discrimination, while others expressed their admiration for her bravery. She had become a symbol of strength and resilience, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. Through it all, the mayor stood by his daughter, proud of the way she had turned her pain into something positive. He knew that their town had been forever changed by the events of that fateful day. But he also knew that change was possible, and that together, they could build a future where everyone felt safe, heard, and respected. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the mayor and his daughter knew that they were no longer fighting alone. The community, too, had joined the fight for justice, and together, they were working toward a brighter, more equitable future. It had been several months since the trial had ended, and the town had started to feel the weight of change. The officer had been convicted and sentenced, but the true challenge had only just begun. The mayor, his daughter, and many others in the community knew that the trial's conclusion was only the first step toward addressing the deeper issues that had been exposed. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with difficult conversations, obstacles, and resistance. But there was also hope, a sense that change was not only possible but necessary. The young woman, now more aware than ever of the struggles faced by so many in her community, continued to be an active voice for reform. She had become a public figure in a way that she never could have imagined before the incident. But despite the attention, she remained grounded, focused on the work that still needed to be done. She knew that the true impact of the case wasn't in the headlines or the media coverage. It was in the lives that could be changed, the policies that could be reformed, and the systems that could be challenged. Her father, the mayor, had worked tirelessly to ensure that the police department was held accountable. He knew that the road to reform would not be easy, especially in a town that had long relied on the same systems and structures. But he was determined to keep pushing forward, to ensure that the officers who served his community would be held to a higher standard. He had already begun working with local leaders, activists, and members of the police force to develop new training programs, focus on community policing, and build trust with the people they were sworn to protect. One of the biggest challenges they faced was the resistance from some within the police department. Some officers, who had been accustomed to the old ways of doing things, were wary of the new direction. They were afraid that the changes would undermine their authority or make their jobs more difficult. But the mayor, along with his daughter, worked to show them that reform wasn't about dismantling the police force. It was about making it stronger, more accountable, and better equipped to serve everyone in the community. The young woman played an important role in these discussions. She was often invited to speak at town meetings, community forums, and even police training sessions. She shared her experience not just as the victim of an officer's misconduct, but as someone who believed deeply in the potential for positive change. Her story was powerful, and it resonated with many people. She was no longer just the mayor's daughter. She was a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope for a better future. Still, there were moments when the young woman felt the weight of the journey. The emotional toll of everything she had been through still lingered. There were nights when she found herself reliving the fear and confusion of that day, when the officer had pointed his gun at her for no reason other than his own bias. Despite the progress that had been made, the scars from that moment remained. But she also knew that by speaking out and sharing her story, she was helping to heal not just herself, but others who had faced similar injustices. The mayor, too, found himself wrestling with the emotional toll of the situation. While he had always been a leader in the community, this experience had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems of power that he had once trusted. He had believed in the police force, but the officers' actions had shaken his faith. He had hoped that the situation would be an isolated incident, but it became clear that the problems ran deeper. It was no longer just about the actions of one officer. It was about the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. In the weeks following the trial, the mayor worked with experts, advocates, and members of the community to develop a comprehensive plan for reform. This plan included everything from improving training on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity to establishing independent oversight committees that could hold officers accountable. The mayor also pushed for better recruitment practices to ensure that the police force reflected the diversity of the community it served. There was resistance, of course. Some people in the community didn't want to accept that change was necessary. They believed that the police were already doing their jobs and that the calls for reform were unwarranted. But the mayor and his daughter were steadfast. They knew that this wasn't just about improving the police force. It was about improving the community as a whole. It was about making sure that everyone, regardless of their background, felt safe and respected. As the months passed, small victories began to accumulate. The new training programs were implemented, and officers began to undergo regular evaluations to ensure that they were meeting the standards set forth by the new policies. There was a renewed focus on community policing, with officers spending more time getting to know the people they served, building relationships, and working to earn the trust that had been lost. The town wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but it was moving in the right direction. For the young woman, these changes were both comforting and bittersweet. She was glad to see that the town was starting to take action, but she couldn't forget that the process of healing would take time. Her own journey wasn't over, and neither was the town's. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but she had faith that the work they were doing would make a difference. One evening, as she sat with her father in their living room, watching the sunset outside their window, the young woman reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the fear and confusion she had felt that day, the way her life had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. But she also thought about the strength she had found in the face of adversity, the way she had pushed through the pain and fear to speak out, to demand justice. Her father sat beside her, his hand resting on hers. He had always been there for her, supporting her, guiding her. He had been a pillar of strength, but even he had been changed by what had happened. They both knew that the road to justice and equality was long, but they also knew that they were on the right path. "You did something incredible," the mayor said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "You helped change this town. You helped us see what we couldn't see before." She smiled, her eyes filled with emotion. "We did it together. This isn't just my story, Dad, it's everyone's. And we're going to keep fighting, keep pushing for change." The mayor nodded, his gaze focused on the horizon. "The fight isn't over. But I believe in us. I believe in this town. And I believe in you." As they sat there side by side, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the night, they both knew that they had done something important. They had taken a stand, fought for what was right, and together had sparked a movement for change. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, they also knew that they were no longer walking it alone. The community, once divided, was now united in its commitment to a better future, and as long as they kept moving forward, there was hope that the town could become a place where everyone, no matter their race, background, or identity, could feel safe, heard, and respected. As the months passed, the town slowly began to heal. It wasn't a quick process. There were setbacks, moments when it felt like the weight of the past would be too much to overcome. But little by little, progress was made, and the community found itself taking the necessary steps toward rebuilding the trust that had been broken. The work wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The mayor, having endured the strain of his position during this turbulent time, found a renewed sense of purpose. He had always cared deeply for the people he served, but now more than ever he realized just how much the community needed him. It wasn't just about passing laws or making speeches. It was about truly listening to the voices of the people, understanding their struggles and doing everything in his power to make their lives better. His daughter, too, was finding her own place in the process of change. Though she had been thrust into the spotlight by the incident, she had come to realize that her voice was one that carried weight. She could no longer remain silent or sit in the background. The young woman had become a powerful advocate for justice, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or mistreated. The town, though small, had become a microcosm of the larger issues facing the country. It was a place where people were beginning to confront the uncomfortable realities of race, privilege, and power. The conversations were difficult, sometimes painful, but they were necessary. The young woman had become a symbol of resilience, of the power of speaking out, of standing up for what was right. And as she continued to speak at forums, town meetings, and rallies, she could see the change that was starting to take root in her community. But for every step forward, there seemed to be another hurdle to overcome. There were still people who resisted the changes being made. They were uncomfortable with the new direction the town was taking. Some felt that the police force was being unfairly criticized, while others thought that the reforms didn't go far enough. It was a constant battle, but the young woman alongside her father kept pushing. They knew that true change wasn't going to come easily, but they also knew that they couldn't give up. The police department, too, was undergoing a transformation. Officers were being retrained in cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and anti-bias practices. It wasn't just about teaching officers how to behave. It was about shifting the culture within the department. For so long, the police had been seen as an authority to be feared, a force that was above reproach. Now the goal was to make them a part of the community, to make them a source of support rather than intimidation. The resistance from some officers was not unexpected. Change was difficult, especially when it meant rethinking the very foundation of one's identity as a police officer. But the new policies were clear. Accountability was no longer optional. The mayor and the police chief made it clear that there would be no more tolerance for officers who misused their power. Those who refused to adapt would have to face the consequences. While the reforms were still in their early stages, the results were starting to show. There were fewer complaints of excessive force, fewer reports of racial profiling. The relationship between the police and the community was starting to improve. But it wasn't just about reducing incidents of misconduct. It was about building trust, about creating an environment where people of all backgrounds could feel safe. And that in itself was a monumental task. For the young woman, the process of reform wasn't just about holding the police accountable, it was about changing the way the town saw itself. She wanted to live in a place where people weren't afraid of the police, where they didn't feel like they were being treated differently because of their skin color. She knew that her journey wasn't over, but she also knew that the seeds of change had been planted. Now it was up to the community to water them, to nurture them, and to help them grow. One evening, as she sat in her father's office looking over reports and listening to the updates from the Reform Task Force, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It hadn't been easy, and there were still many challenges ahead, but the town was moving in the right direction. The mayor's leadership, combined with the tireless work of local activists and the courage of the people who had been affected by the officers' actions, had created a momentum that couldn't be stopped. "Do you think we'll ever be done with this?" she asked her father, her voice thoughtful as she looked up from the papers in front of her. Her father leaned back in his chair, his gaze focused on the window, watching as the sun began to set. "I don't think it's something that can ever be fully done," he said after a moment. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying. We keep going. We keep improving. We make sure that the future we build is better than the past we've had." She nodded, taking in his words. It was true. No matter how much progress was made, there would always be work to do. There would always be more voices to listen to, more stories to hear, more injustices to fight against. But as long as people kept fighting for change, as long as they kept pushing forward, things would get better. The town was beginning to understand that the work of reform wasn't just about changing laws or policies. It was about changing hearts and minds. It was about creating a culture of respect, of empathy, and of understanding. And that was the real challenge. It wasn't enough to change the systems. It was about changing the way people thought, the way they viewed each other. As the days passed, the young woman found herself in a place she had never expected. She had gone from being a victim of injustice to becoming a leader in the fight for equality. It hadn't been an easy journey, and there had been moments when she had wanted to give up, to walk away from it all. But now, looking at the progress that had been made, she knew that every struggle, every challenge had been worth it. Her father, too, had learned and grown through the experience. The man who had once been a figure of authority, a leader in the community, had been forced to confront the flaws in the system he had once trusted. And while the journey had been difficult for him, he had come to realize that it was only through acknowledging these flaws that real change could occur. The experience had shaped him, changed him, and made him a better leader. And together they both understood that change wasn't just about the victory in the courtroom or the reforms that had been put in place. It was about the ongoing work, the hard work, that would continue long after the headlines had faded and the cameras had gone away. As the town continued to move forward, there were still challenges, still moments when it seemed like the old ways might take over. But the young woman with her father by her side knew that the town would never go back to the way it was before. They had learned too much, fought too hard, and come too far to ever let that happen. The work of rebuilding trust, of creating a fairer and more just society, was ongoing. But in their hearts, the young woman and her father knew that they had made a difference. And as they looked toward the future, they were ready to keep fighting, keep pushing, and keep striving for a better world.